I don't know what to say to the people who will defend Canon no matter what with the R5 and the R6 overheating. I mean, this is reported. The R5 and the R6, they have heating problems. Will this be fixed? Could be. I hope so. I personally wanted to buy an R5 or an R6 based on the specs that Canon said were going to be available in these cameras. And then the previews and the reviews hit, and people said it's not actually that usable for video. Photography is great, and that's awesome. I love a good photography camera. I would love the 45 megapixels. I'd love to use the R5 in all its glory, but you can't all the time. And I understand that people, say it's a photography camera. If you want a video camera, just go buy a real video camera, like the Ursa Mini Pro, right? Like that's not what I want though. Like I have that. I want something that's a hybrid that does it all in one box. And people say that's impossible. Canon and the R5, it's 45 megapixels. What do you expect? They just can't do it. It's not physically possible. And the thing to remember in that situation is that the R6 also overheats, and that's a 20 megapixel sensor. The S1H is a 24 megapixel sensor. So it's not about just the megapixels. It's about the way these cameras were designed, where they're built. It could have been intentional. People want to say this is Canon crippling these cameras to protect their Cinema EOS line. That could be. It could be total ignorance. We just don't know why these things are happening. But the fact is they are happening, and we can theorize and question and say, why did this happen? Well, if you look at the design of it, it looks like they didn't do a lot in terms of thermal management. Maybe you say, well, they couldn't. It was impossible to have it sealed, to do all the stuff. It's impossible. And it's 45 megapixels. And it's like, okay, so that's why I want to focus on the R6, because the R6 in my mind is the real tragedy. The R6 could have been that just perfect all around a hybrid camera that works for everybody. You don't need the 8K RAW. Maybe you don't even need 4K 120 on the R5. And maybe the R5 is 45 megapixels and it just overheats because it's the nature of 45 megapixels. But with 20 megapixels, you're telling me that they couldn't figure out 4K 60 with 20 megapixels. It was impossible. Canon couldn't do it. Meanwhile, Sony's doing 4K 120 from 12 megapixels, so that's less. But Canon, this premium, amazing company, couldn't get the R6 in a functional state for the people who do both photo and video, who want a hybrid camera. I don't always want to lug a giant cinema camera around or have something that just does video, because I might want to do photography as well on the same shoot. And to not be able to criticize this, I think is a little unfair in Canon's favor. If you say you can't criticize Canon, they're doing the best they can. These cameras are meant for photography first and foremost, which fine, I'll accept you at that argument, but you should still be able to criticize them for their lack of a fault, of a detriment to the camera system. And the absolute equation on the other side that I would use to this is Panasonic and how bad their autofocus is compared to Canon and Sony. Panasonic is criticized, dragged through the mud for how bad their autofocus is, and I'll never buy a Panasonic because their autofocus is terrible. That is fair. That is a fair criticism. If you could make arguments and say, well, they don't have the technology. Oh, give them a break. Yada yada. And people do, but to not admit that it's a problem. I think everybody who defends Panasonic says, yeah, the autofocus is bad on these Lumix cameras, but I like all the other features instead. And I don't see that same understanding from the people who want to defend Canon in the R5 and R6 situation. If you say, yeah, it sucks these things overheat, I wish they didn't, but I'll get it for, the photography modes. Totally fine. Totally fine and fair argument. But if you say, oh no, if you want a video camera, buy a real video camera then. These are photography cameras. That's the leap too far, because you could say the exact same thing about Panasonic and it's like, oh, if you want autofocus, well, then just buy a photography camera. It's like, well, yeah, I am. I'm buying a hybrid because for photography, I want the autofocus to work. It's fair. It's a criticism. And it's so weird to me that these things aren't equally valued, that it's okay to criticize Panasonic for their bad autofocus, which I admit it is bad comparatively to Canon and Sony, which do much, much better. And then it's not okay to criticize Canon for a camera that overheats. Not even the R5. I'll give it to them. The R5, yeah, it overheats. 45 megapixels is impossible to keep cool. All right, great. But what about the R6? And why are these recovery times so crazy? They didn't factor any of this into when they put these specs out there, and they said the R5 and R6 are, to be there, the R5 right along Hollywood as a B camera for, your cinema line. They said this stuff. So why isn't it a valid criticism? I genuinely am curious. I don't understand why it's okay to criticize Panasonic for the autofocus, but it's not okay to criticize Canon for maybe their design, or maybe we'll find out that it's truly confirmed that there's some software manipulation going on, that these cameras really aren't overheating. Because apparently, people are talking about you can record externally without cards in the R5. So clearly the camera can do it, it just can't process it to a memory card. Is that a firmware loophole or bug, and your sensor is going to be degraded over time? I know there's a lot of thought around, well, the sensor heating up is just bad for the sensor in terms of image performance, and that's true. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. You don't want to be doing time lapses, like long exposure photography when it's 115 out. You're going to get a lot more noise interference than if it's a nice cold night. So heat is definitely a factor for sensors. It matters. But when you look at the internals of the R5 and you say, oh, they didn't really do any thermal management here, like maybe they could have done something better. There's an article over on Canon News that, spells out pretty plainly from their perspective that, oh, it was impossible. There was nothing they could have done. And I think the R6, surely the R6 could have been spared in all this. But no, that's the real tragedy. I think a lot of people would understand the R5 if it just is pushing the limits and the boundaries. Full frame, 45 megapixels is impressive. 8K RAW, 4K 120, these are impressive specs for the R5. But the R6 should have and could have been that amazing in-between beautiful hybrid that everyone would have embraced and loved and bought more Canon lenses and just celebrated how amazing the R6 is. And yet, even that is plagued by overheating to the point where you have to drop it down to 1080. In 2020, you have to shoot with a $2,500 camera in 1080p mode. And that, to me, is just the point where if it's malice, if they did it intentionally to protect the cinema line, then shame on them. If it's ignorance and they just don't know how to do it, or they didn't want to, or they didn't care to, also shame on them. I don't know how you defend it and say it's just a photography camera, because you could say the same thing about Panasonic and the autofocus. Well, it's just a video camera. You don't even need autofocus. Why do you need autofocus? Aren't you good enough to use manual focus? Way back when there wasn't autofocus, everyone was manual focusing. A lot of lenses don't even have autofocus and they're manual focus only. So why do you need autofocus? If you're a real photographer, you don't need autofocus. See, there's always crazy arguments you can come up and spin up to defend one way or the other. I think it's fair in any situation to criticize and point out and just say, hey, this is a problem. Why is it a problem? Figure it out. People are pulling these cameras apart, testing them, trying to figure out, why is this an issue? Can we fix it? Is there something we can do as shooters, as owner operators to fix these problems? Same thing with Panasonic. There were people digging through those menus, trying to optimize the autofocus on all the Lumix cameras always, because it's like, oh, if you get these settings, do -3 and then +1, and then that'll be the perfect autofocus for this situation. And it's like you can do it to death, but at the end of the day, it's still a criticism that the autofocus isn't all that great and it's not that reliable. So that should encourage the camera manufacturer to say, well, we got to figure this out. And likewise for Canon, they got to figure it out, because these cameras should be able to do these things. Should be able to. The R5, again, counting that one out. That one's off the table. Fine, I'll give it to you. Let's talk about the R6. It's a tragedy that that's not a better camera, because it really should be.